On one side, you are being told to create your own reality, and on the other side, you are told to surrender. So, what do you do with this, right? It's quite challenging to understand this, and not only to understand it, but come to really overcome the challenge in your own life. The idea of creating your own reality is a metaphysical idea, and the idea of surrendering is a mystical idea, and they are not compatible. Because if you are trying to create your own reality, obviously you are manipulating, you are controlling, and that's not surrender. So the spiritual path goes through two different stages. In the first stage, we try to overcome the state of the victim, where we feel powerless in life, and we move to the state of victorhood, which is accomplished through metaphysical methods and metaphysical teachings on how to create your own reality, which starts with positive thinking, right? So many spiritual paths are strongly connected and emphasizing this phase of the spiritual path, but then they tell you, well, you need to surrender and then you need to let go of all these manipulations. But it's rarely clear in the different traditions the difference between one stage and the next, the metaphysical and the mystical. So I want to explain this more in details from the perspective of Yogananda's teachings. And in order to do that, I would like to start with a personal experience, an experience that happened to this mind-body organism. And at that time, I was very involved in the metaphysical aspect of Yogananda's teachings, which is massive. It's presented in the 180 lessons and the many books. And these metaphysical teachings are mostly about creating your own reality. But at the same time, there was the beginnings here of the desire to explore surrender. And in order to do that, I began to look into the teachings. What was there about surrender? And I was having difficulties to find information in the lessons, although there is some there in Yogananda's poems. So eventually what happened was that SRF published a tape titled Devotion by Brother Anandamoy. Devotion, I think its deepest meaning or something around that. And I suspected that in that tape was what I was looking for. So I began to play it in my car, and yes, there was some reference there to devotion, to surrender, which, by the way, Anandamoy explains in his tape that it is the same as devotion. Or, I would say he goes even farther. He says that is the highest expression of devotion. Surrender, the highest expression of devotion. So I began to listen to this tape, but it was very difficult for me to understand it. And I was at that time practicing many techniques techniques of meditation and positive thinking and affirmations and the typical metaphysical aspect of Yogananda's teachings, which is somewhat common to many other traditions in different expressions. And at some point during the tape, Ananda Moy says something very strange that really was surprising to me. He says that surrender and devotion are the same, and surrender is now the only thing that I practice. He says it very fast. That's the only thing I practice now. And I said, what a strange thing, because we are supposed to practice all these many methods and techniques and meditation techniques and so on and so on. So how this monk that is supposed to be an example is just practicing one thing? So what about Kriya? What about this? What about that? But he says just one thing. He didn't say Kriya and surrender. He said just surrender in his tape. And then I kept on listening to the tape, but I couldn't get it. To begin with, you can imagine the difficulty of a seeker that has been practicing all these many techniques and meditation morning and night and relies on all this to keep his or her balance, to let go of all that. That's huge. If you are into that level of intense practice, metaphysical practices, you know how scary it could be that suddenly you say, I'm going to let go of all this, right? And I'm going to just practice surrender. The problem, however, still is there, that manipulations and from the I-centeredness, I am trying and making an effort and creating my own reality, and I'm after God and I want to find God, and so it's all an I-centered project, ego-centered project, which means that is at that level is what is active is the spiritual ego. The spiritual ego is more subtle than the material ego, but still is nasty in a way, and still needs to go in order for self-realization to happen. The self with capital, which is not the little self, is not the ego, of course. So as long as we are persevering and fighting and so on with our own forces and strengths, we are in a way strengthening the ego. A more subtle ego, it's called spiritual ego, but still is ego. And for self-realization to really happen, the ego has to go. So there you are stuck in this situation, right? And that's why that moment is called the dark night of the soul. In some traditions, I know that there are different interpretations, but I like this interpretation because that moment is very decisive, and all the manipulations and methods you have learned that have given you some results, you are very attached to them. So when you let them go, you really don't know what's going to happen. It's like jumping into the unknown in the dark night. And in my case, I needed more information than that in order to take such a step. But I want to tell you something else about the teachings, Yogananda's teachings, from the very direct disciples. Ananda Moy was a direct disciple for 3 years of Yogananda. And I was living very close by with to Bhaktananda also, who was Yogananda's direct disciple for 14 years. And there was something interesting about about Bhaktananda also, that now and then during his talks at the Hollywood Temple, he was saying something that was really puzzling for me, because in an ocean of metaphysics and methods to control the mind, to control the energy, to control our reality, to control this, to control that, now and then he would say in his talks and services, the only way to find God is complete surrender to Him. I said, what? So why are we doing other things? Why are we doing all these things, hundreds in a way, and why we're not really talking about surrender here, instead of talking about other things, lots of metaphysical issues, and psychological issues, and blah blah. Well, there are reasons for that, and they have to do with this process of evolution of the soul, and is that to the services, most people that go there, they are in need of metaphysical teachings, and then SRF provides that. But eventually, monks that were more advanced, like Bhaktananda and Anandamoy, and probably the old matas, they got it. At some point they got it, that the only thing you need to practice is surrender. So, and that in order to find God, which means self-realization, right? As Bhaktananda put it, you need to have complete surrender to Him. So, what can we do to solve this conundrum? It's very personal, Each one will have their own way to reach that point and to let go. But in my case, in the case of this organism called Gian, I needed much more information. I began to look for information in the lessons, and I didn't find anything. I found, as I said, some information in the poems, in Yogananda's poems. And so I began to look into Eckhart Tolle's teachings, and the power of now, and other non-duality teachers like Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta Maharaj and Adyashanti, teachers that were very focused into surrender. And that helped me to get enough understanding to make this transition a very challenging transition. And eventually it happened. And in that process, there was one thing that really, really helped to consolidate the surrendering. And you could call it awakening. Awakening really, really help you. It's very necessary for surrender to begin to happen seriously. And what is awakening? Awakening is that you simply see with great clarity and realization that the I or me or the little self that you thought it was like a little piece of consciousness that is inside, separated from the universe and so on, is a story. It doesn't exist. And you don't need a spiritual experience to realize this. This is the strangest thing, It's not a spiritual experience. It's a clear looking into the human experience. And it requires so much clarity that is challenging too. So after the awakening, I created an awakening protocol methodology that is a session that takes 3 hours to trigger the awakening in my students. And I have been presenting that for years. And I would recommend that you go to the website brainoptimization.com, and at the top you will see a tab that says Reads Awakening, and read that. I would recommend that you pursue awakening, because surrender from the ego state, from the believing that you are this I, this me, this little self, it's almost impossible. So awakening is a big push into successful surrender, not an intellectual surrendering, but successful actual surrendering. And that surrendering is not necessarily to an external God. It's a surrendering to life, the same life that is your life, the same life that is everywhere in the universe, that is immensely intelligent and wise, and that you can trust completely its wisdom. So I hope this helps you to take the step to move from the metaphysical to the mystical. The mystical is complete surrender. The metaphysical is I create my own reality. Both have their place, but the metaphysical comes first and the mystical comes later. And it's not necessary to delay too much the passage to the mystical by insisting too much into making it through the metaphysical to attain self-realization, because metaphysical teachings will not lead to self-realization. They will give you glimpses, perhaps, but you need to surrender and you need to wake up. And for that, you need to learn to surrender. That learning is called the mystical path, which is different than the metaphysical path, which leads to the state of vehicle, not victor, not the victor state, but the vehicle state. Take care. Down below this YouTube, you will find a link that leads to that page, the page in the website, in our website that I mentioned on awakening, the awakening protocol. Bye. Take care.